Hey, I'm Bob Cargill, and welcome to Bible Archaeology. With the Easter season upon us, we thought it might be the perfect time to dig a little deeper into the events that unfolded after the crucifixion of Jesus, according to the biblical accounts. Now, while all four gospel narratives describe the events after Jesus' death and convey a similar overarching concept, when we closely examine the details of these four gospels, the harmonization of the narratives that typically take place creates misconceptions of each gospel account's individual details. We may all think we know the story of the stone being removed from the front of the tomb, or of someone appearing to convey the message of Jesus' resurrection, or of Jesus making various resurrection appearances. But within each of these narratives, important details vary from gospel to gospel concerning the details as to how the stone was removed, or who appeared at the tomb, and to whom, where, and when did Jesus appear after his death. Today we want to dive into the details of these individual narratives and the unique stories preserved within these individual gospel accounts. So who actually visited the tomb? After the crucifixion of Jesus, we are told in all four Gospels that Jesus' tomb was visited by various individuals. But who exactly came to the tomb? According to Matthew 28:1, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. However, in Mark 16:1, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices. Now, while it can be inferred that the other Mary in Matthew is specifically identified in Mark, the accounts do not provide the same details. The Gospel of Luke simply says the women were the ones that came to the tomb, later specifying them as Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women, describing not only Mary Magdalene and the mother of James, including Salome, whom Mark excludes, and Joanna and the other women also not described in Matthew and Mark. The Gospel of John uniquely identifies only Mary Magdalene as the one who initially comes to the tomb. However, she runs into Simon Peter and another disciple once she finds the stone removed. Although Matthew and Mark are very similar in their description of the two who first visited the tomb, Luke and John differ greatly in this number, creating a discrepancy in the narrative as to who first came to the tomb of Jesus. Now, harmonizing the gospel accounts, that is, mashing them all together into one story saying, they all came, is what a lot of people do. But we must remember that this is not what each of the individual gospel accounts say. They differ, and we're not sure which one is correct. And it is this ambiguity that causes people to cheat, or let's say harmonize, and say, well, they were all there. See? Problem fixed. Which brings us to our second question. How was the stone removed, and who appeared at the tomb? Upon arrival at the tomb, we are told in all four Gospels that the stone in front of the tomb was removed, and yet there is disagreement among the narratives as to how this event occurred, as well as who appears immediately following this. The Gospel of Mark tells us that when the women reached the tomb, they had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. The Gospel of Mark describes an ambiguous man dressed in a white robe without an explicit description of how the stone had been removed. Now, the Gospel of Luke offers a similar narrative of how Mary Magdalene and some other number of women found the tomb with the stone rolled away. However, Luke 24 tells us that suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them, creating a discrepancy in the narratives concerning both the number of people who appeared and the description of clothing. Diversely, the Gospel of Matthew tells us that there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord, descending from heaven, came and rolled the stone back and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow, showcasing a divine event that caused the removal of the stone and an explicit identification of the figure as an angel, with a more detailed description of his appearance. The presence of the earthquake is unique in Matthew, making it the only gospel with an explanation of how the stone was removed. John offers a very different account of what happened once the tomb was reached, agreeing with Mark and Luke that the stone had been removed upon arrival. Yet he describes that Mary Magdalene and 2 disciples found linen wrappings within the tomb. And from here, the disciples assumed that he had risen from the dead and returned to their homes. It is only after this that 2 angels appear to Mary Magdalene. Now, all 4 accounts of this episode in the Gospels present similar, although conflicting details. While Luke, Mark, and John describe the stone being removed upon their arrival, Matthew records that an angel caused this. Furthermore, John and Luke describe 2 figures appearing at the side of the tomb. Luke names them as men, and John names them as angels. Similarly, Mark chronicles a singular figure who appears as a man, whereas Matthew reports it being an angel. The accounts do not agree on how the stone was removed, nor do they agree on how many people appeared, or the explicit identities of these figures. Finally, we have to ask, to whom did Jesus appear first and when? Following the events of the tomb, the Gospels state that Jesus appears once again. But as we've seen, the details of these appearances conflict from gospel to gospel. In Luke, Jesus appears to the men, walking on the same day, in an unrecognizable state, and it is not until they are eating with him, much later, that they recognize him. While similarly, in John, Jesus first appears in an unrecognizable state, as he appears to Mary Magdalene alone at the site of the tomb, and she mistakes him for the gardener. In Matthew, after Mary and Mary speak with the angel, they leave the tomb to tell Jesus' disciples, when suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings," and they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Matthew notes that after leaving, Jesus appeared to the 2 women, and immediately they were able to recognize him. Now, here's what's interesting about Mark. While some versions of the Gospel of Mark include Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, most scholars point out that the original end of the narrative of Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8. And if you look carefully at your footnotes in your Bible at Mark 16, verse 9, it will say that verses 9 through 20 do not appear in any of the earliest copies of the Gospel of Mark, and are therefore likely a later addition to Mark's Gospel. Thus, the resurrection appearances that occur in Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, are likely copied over from one of the other Gospels, so that the end of Mark doesn't end abruptly after verse 8. You know, how the final episode of The Sopranos ends, and you don't really know what happens after it goes to black. So none of the Gospel narratives agree as to whom Jesus appeared, when he appeared, and how he appeared, further highlighting the discrepancies and details of his resurrection appearances. So, although the discrepancies within the Gospel accounts conflict and contradict one another, they reflect the complexities of these traditions and how they were preserved within early Christian communities. Each Gospel preserves a unique perspective, emphasizing different characters and details and representations of the events following the crucifixion. It is important to recognize the differences between these accounts, rather than simply harmonizing them into a singular account. We want to do this. We want to recognize these differences because we want to understand the different ideas that each of the gospel authors wanted to emphasize to their readers that form the separate gospel accounts that we still read today. We don't harmonize accounts in any other situation today. If 4 different people witness a bank robbery, and one says the robber fleeing out of the front of the bank was a man, and another says it was a woman, and a third person says it was 2 teenagers on motorcycles, and a fourth person says it was a cowboy on a horse, none of us would harmonize these 4 accounts together and conclude that the bank was obviously robbed by a man and a woman and 2 teenagers on motorcycles and a cowboy on a horse. But unfortunately, this is what we do too often to the gospel accounts. Instead of reading each gospel for what they say individually and conceding that they may be recording conflicting accounts, but trying to understand that the details of each account mean something different for each individual author, that is, why they included the details they did, instead, we try to harmonize them together into a story that never actually existed. Because at the end of the day, we need to remember it's all a miracle. They all of these Gospels include a man coming back from the dead 2,000 years ago. You're going to believe this story or not. You're going to believe it or you're not going to believe it. Whether or not the specific details match or don't match doesn't really matter. We hope you enjoyed this dive into the details of these resurrection accounts. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Bob Cargill wishing you everything the best.